Is director for the Latin America region at Greenmantle. He also teaches at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. Always a pleasure, Daniel.
Thank you for having me on, Francois. It's always a lot of fun.
Daniel, the general strike, first since 2002. Those who know their history know that at the time, the general strike kind of backfired. At the time, Hugo Chavez was the president. He came out of it bolstered. How high are the stakes today?
Well, the stakes have gotten much higher. Venezuela is locked in essentially a vicious spiral in which the government's popularity falls, but the institutional mechanisms that would normally allow for change at the top under such circumstances, for example, recall referendums, have been attempted and not been allowed through as the different institutions within the country have become more tied, both personally and institutionally, to the executive. So essentially, there's it's like a corked bottle that is ready to explode, but the cork is latched on too tight. So the opposition is making moves to show, to highlight both internationally and domestically how weak the government support levels have become. The plebiscite over last weekend was a great example of that. 7.5 million people voted. But as one of the things that a lot of people, you were mentioning, is that 10% of those were actually Venezuelans voting abroad, who are legally allowed to vote under Article 64 of the Venezuelan Constitution, but the government has made very difficult in practice for them to vote. So the differential between the people abroad who voted in the opposition plebiscite, which was easier to vote in because there were a lot more places where one could vote, is actually more than the differential that initially allowed Maduro to be elected back in 2013.
That plebiscite happened on Sunday. Today we're Thursday. Is it ancient history now, or is this a moment that's going to matter as we build up to that July 30th vote that's being organized by the government?
Well, there are few things that can block the government from doing what they want. The two institutions that would technically be able to do so would be the Electoral Commission, the CNE, and the courts. But both of them are very much in league with the executive right now, and traditionally have, continuously backed it, whatever it's trying to do. So stopping it will be difficult. But things like the plebiscite and now the national strike are ways of illustrating the extent to which this is a government that has been hijacked by the revolution, and that any legitimacy it may have once had during the popular days of Chavez has long since been squandered and lost under Maduro.
On Monday, the United States, for the first time, floating the idea of ratcheted up sanctions. Does that help or hurt the cause of the opposition?
So that's a great question. The greater engagement from the international community, I believe, is vital. The international community has taken very much of a wait-and-see policy towards Venezuela as its crisis has intensified, which I do not think has helped matters. That said, the Trump administration has moved with, the sort of trademark sledgehammer subtlety in which it tends to move. And implied the idea of large-scale economic sanctions, potentially on par with what took place against Russia after the invasion of Crimea, rather than what we've seen thus far, which is targeted sanctions against individuals. Targeted sanctions against individuals can actually exacerbate rifts and undermine the sense of impunity within the government, which I believe weakens it. And I welcome those. The idea of general sanctions against PDVSA is more complicated because it would almost certainly force a default, as Venezuela's access to dollars would be hamstrung overnight. And that default would seriously imperil the rather delicate lifelines of imports that keep Venezuela, which produces very little domestically, hovering at the border between shortages and outright famine. So the costs of a general sanction would be very high to the Venezuelan people. And in some ways, it may be counterproductive in reinforcing this rhetoric that Maduro has leaned on very heavily throughout his tenure, that the problems in Venezuela are externally imposed by foreign imperialism rather than the errors of his own mismanaged policy and the bad policies, both economically and politically, of the revolution over the last 16 years.
With the incoming administration slow to fill vacancies at places like the State Department, do you have a sense that Washington right now understands what's going on in Venezuela?
Well, that's a great. I mean, that's a really important part of this story. The State Department and the Treasury and the Defense Department, which traditionally often play a role in things like general sanctions, are, from what I'm hearing, not particularly involved. This is something that's coming from the White House directly. And that's, given a lot of the interesting things that are going on domestically, having, a foreign policy win, which or something that can be spun as a foreign policy win, could be beneficial. But at the same time, it could also be dangerous, because if PDVSA were to have a general default, 49.9% of Citgo would go to the Russians. Which means that with a few more, with a little bit more, 1% or 0.1% more in hands of, an allied, nominally independent figure, you would have Russian control over Citgo, the optics of which, particularly given some of the other things going on with the Trump administration now, would be complicated. So there's a lot of moving parts to this. I don't think we're at the point of general sanctions yet. That said, as the Trump administration strives to move a lot of the focus domestically to international issues rather than domestic problems, I wouldn't put anything past it.
Daniel Lansberg Rodriguez of Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management, many thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, Francois.
Time now for a look at what's been capturing the minds of the French this Thursday, the last summit finish in this year's Tour de France. Plenty of drama. Frenchman Warren Barguil grimacing his way to the top of the Izoard to